Welcome to Making and Unmaking Literature in the Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna ghettos. This is the first study devoted to how little known but essential authors grappled with the destitution of ghetto existence and brilliantly meditated on the grotesque incongruities between established literary models and the extreme conditions of ghetto existence. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Usher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Sven-Erik Rose, who is a professor of German and of comparative literature and the director of the program in Jewish Studies at the University of California, Davis. His scholarship and teaching focus on Jewish literature and intellectual history from Germany, France, and Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europe. His first book, Jewish Philosophical Politics in Germany, 1789 to 1848, Brandeis University Press, 2014, was awarded the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish Studies in the category of Philosophy and Jewish Thought. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm delighted for the invitation to participate in this series, especially in view of that I know it's focused on visual art, and I'm going to be talking about literature. But I find that people who are interested in visual art tend to be interested in text and vice versa. So I think we'll have plenty to talk about. And I'd like to start my talk with a few slides that provide some context. And so unlike often with literature, we can kind of take for granted that we have the text that we're reading and move on to interpretation of them. However, texts that were written during the Holocaust were extremely contingent, right? The fact that they have actually come down to us is somewhat miraculous. And many texts did not come down to us. So I want to just say how the text, I'm going to be focusing mostly on a single text today, but I want to talk about how that text and many other texts came down to us. So each text has an incredible story. And so the text I talk about from the Lodz ghetto and the Vilna ghetto all have incredible stories, but I'm going to talk here about the preservation of documents from the Warsaw ghetto. And these were preserved in an archive, and there was an archival project, a clandestine project. They tried to keep this hidden from the Nazi authorities, and it was led by the Polish Jewish historian Emanuel Ringelblum, who ended up being killed in the Holocaust. But he led this project to document as much as possible from as many perspectives, and from sort of realia, daily meal tickets, and to literary writing, to testimony about what happened in the different shtetls that people were deported from into the ghetto, and everything that basically as much as fully encompassing account of life in the ghetto as possible. And I want to talk about the importance of writing within that archive. So it wasn't only about documentation, but also writing generally, but especially literary writing is what I'm focusing on in this book. So Ringelblum writes, this is an essay that he wrote and put in one of the caches of the archive that they buried in the Warsaw ghetto, and two of the three caches they buried were recovered after the war. I'll talk more about how in a moment. So he wrote an essay kind of at the end of this project as the ghetto was being destroyed, and he put that in as a kind of a guide to what this whole archive was about. And in that, he says, everyone wrote, journalists, writers, teachers, community activists, young people, even children. And he says a lot was destroyed with the people that were deported and murdered, but some of it was preserved mostly in this archive. But the importance of writing, so people were writing, and there are a lot of accounts of how much people were writing in the ghettos. The code name for this archive was Oneg Shabbos, Oneg Shabbat in contemporary modern Hebrew. That's simply because they met on Saturdays on the Shabbat. Even though they were secular mostly. So he says, during the present war, everyone has been writing something, particularly diaries, and that was by far the most common genre of writing in the ghettos. And Chava Rosenfarb is someone from the Lodz ghetto, someone who, shouldn't say from the Lodz ghetto, someone who was imprisoned in the Lodz ghetto and survived. And she wrote a lot in the Lodz ghetto, but all of her writings were taken from her when she was deported and destroyed. But she survived and wrote a retrospective, account and said, even children and old people were infected with the literary bug. In the ghetto, along with tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery, there raged the epidemic of writing. And she goes on in that vein. Um, Also, I'll mention Yechiel Scheintuch, who is a professor emeritus from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who was a professor of Yiddish literature and had a special focus on writing during the years of the Holocaust. And he says, it seems that in no other period of Jewish history was so much written in a limited number of years by so many authors. Just to give a sense of the scope of writing in these years. And I want to come back to another text by Ringelblum, which is not the same essay I quoted before, but rather his diary that he kept in the Warsaw Ghetto. And and he says, and this is, by the way, just a week or so before the Great Deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, when in a span of 6 weeks, almost 300,000 people were deported and killed in Treblinka. So this is, relatively late in the game. This is not the first week or two of the ghetto, and he's still considering literature and reading to be vitally important. What are people reading? This is a question that will be of general interest after the war. It will intrigue the world. What the world will ask, did people think of on Musadag or in the Warsaw Ghetto? Musadag is, of course, the mountain where during the Armenian genocide, people retreated and tried to hold out. And says, people who knew for certainty that death would no more skip over them than it had over other large Jewish settlements and the small towns. Let it be said that though we have been sentenced to death and know it, we have not lost our human features. Our minds are as active as they were before the war. This is very important, I think. He's saying that we know we've seen people being murdered. We know what's going to happen to us. We have no illusions that we're going to be spared, and yet it's of general historical importance that people know that we are continuing to read books. And so the absolute importance of literature for the sort of human identity of people in these extreme times is what I'm trying to focus on here. Um, and one second, having some trouble advancing my slides. Can I do that this way? Yes. So the Warsaw Ghetto archive was preserved in three tranches, two of which, like I said, were recoverable. And the first one was in these tins that you see to the left, and the second in the milk cans. So the essay that I quoted from Ringelblum, for example, was in the milk cans. Um, and the first tranche was recovered because two people, only two of the entire archival team survived and worked tirelessly to find them. The other ones, the milk cans, Warsaw was so bombed out and destroyed, and they were obviously, rebuilding a lot of the city after the war. And when they were digging to make a foundation, they happened upon these milk cans. One of these milk cans is on permanent display at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So if you passed by it, think about what the significance is. It's easy to walk by not realizing. Um, and of course, the second tranche was recovered in December 1950 at the sort of the height of the Cold War, which had a lot to do with its reception. But I don't have time to go into that right now. Um, but I will continue to advance. And so here's a somewhat staged picture um, of two people, the two people who knew where this archive was buried, and it's Rochel Auerbach or Rochel Auerbach, depending on how you pronounce her name, and Herr Schwasser. These are the only two people that knew where these documents were buried. And Herr Schwasser, to give you a sense of just how precarious this all is, Herr Schwasser survived. He was on a train bound for Treblinka and threw himself from that train and actually survived that way. Rachel Auerbach spoke accent-free Polish. So she was able to survive with false papers on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw, and both of them worked to find this first tranche of documents. And there's another picture of them. By the way, I'm going to be focusing on a text by Lady Golden that has a the central plot is getting a bowl of soup at a soup kitchen, and it's based on a real thing. It's very autobiographical, this story. Rachel Auerbach was the person who ran that kitchen in the Warsaw Ghetto. Um, so here's a picture of scholars at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw sorting the documents that were in the second tranche of documents that were recovered. And this is where the permanent home of these documents is to this day at the Jewish Historical Institute, or the JIH, in Warsaw. There's also electronic copies at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. So I want to mention, if you're interested in finding a good anthology that's readily available uh, with a number of documents, literary texts, and writings from the Warsaw Ghetto, this is a good Voices from the Warsaw Ghetto, edited by the a preeminent scholar of wartime writing, David Giroskis, and the preeminent historian of this period, Samuel Kassow. That's available. This is actually a still from a movie. This is an actress playing Rachel Auerbach, the woman that I just showed you in the picture. And that movie is based on the account by Sam Kassow, Who Will Write Our History. That's also links to what the next event, Who Will Draw Our History, is referring back to this question that was very a burning question for people in the Warsaw Ghetto. Will it be the Nazis or will it be us? And if it's us, we have to document things. So the documentary and somewhat fictionalized film by Roberta Grossman is also called Who Will Write Our History, and Samuel Kassow and David Roskis, the scholars I mentioned, are talking heads in this. And it also has some dramatization of stories, including the one that we'll be focusing on today by Leib Golden. So that if you see that, you'll recognize the text that we're going to explore today. So I'm not going to go into detail about every chapter of my book, because I think that would take too much time. But here's the beginning of the table of contents, and I'll jump in and give you some background and get into this text that I want to explore with you today. So more generally, though, the important role that literature played in the lives of inmates of Nazi ghettos follows from the explosion of literary culture among East European Jews from the turn of the 20th century. Indeed, literature provided one of the chief means through which Polish Jews negotiated the transition out of a traditional Jewish social, cultural, and religious framework into secular European culture and society, and what they considered as something like human citizenship. Although the dire and traumatic circumstances of the Nazi ghetto strained and challenged cultural frameworks by which Jews had made sense of their pre-war lives, reading and writing remained constant dimensions of ghetto life from their establishment to their final liquidation, as we saw already with those introductory quotes that I had on slides. Works of literature written in ghettos in Poland reveal how their authors both took refuge in the humanistic resources of literature, affirmed and confirmed their humanity, and put the codes and conventions of various literary genres, as it were, on trial. As the scholar of Jewish literature David Roskis has shown, much writing from the ghettos turned to traditional Jewish texts and archetypes in a desperate search for analogies to the unprecedented events at hand. So to traditional biblical and classical analogies and archetypes. However, a great deal of literary writing from the ghettos also self-consciously surveyed and sifted, wrote and unwrote genres, strategies, and tropes of secular European literature. And these quote unquote Jewish and quote unquote European orientations were by no means mutually exclusive. In the 9 chapters of my book, I explore how, in the extreme circumstances of a ghetto, classic European literary scenarios, tropes, plot lines, and generic conventions, including those of nature lyric, modernist interior monologue, which we'll explore today, the realist social novel, the detective story, and the Gothic horror tale, all offered writers crucial resources for thinking through their individual and collective plight. At the same time, I trace how these literary resources frequently struck writers as incommensurate with the prevailing conditions of destitution, starvation, disease, and mass death. An ambivalent refuge, literature was rich and capacious enough to allow ghetto writers to meditate in literary works on and at literature's limits. My aim in this study was not to exhaustively catalog the literary writings from the ghettos, but rather to carefully engage with a selection of texts that grapple with the unfolding horrors through highly literary means. The book's most fundamental conceptual and methodological point of departure is to try to understand how people confined to ghettos thought, how they thought in those extreme conditions with, through, and about literature. With his intentionally provocative statements about the barbarity of writing poetry, quote unquote, after Auschwitz, Theodor Adorno pushed us to reflect on our relationship to literature in the face of the catastrophe of the Holocaust. I think it's more productive at this point, certainly, to place the proliferation of readings and misreadings of Adorno to one side in order to explore the less exhaustive question of how Holocaust victims themselves, as members of a highly literary culture, thought in literary keys. When wartime literary texts are consulted at all, it is typically for their documentary or testimonial value, not for the type of dense and nuanced reflection constitutive of literary discourse. The extensive body of theoretical work pondering the Holocaust has rarely considered victims thinking about their experience in real time as necessary interlocutors and serious thinkers in their own right. Ghettoization placed European Jews in positions of radical exclusion, danger, and destitution. Yet it also afforded them, or rather, it imposed on them, a singular critical and epistemological vantage point. Ghettoization removed people from European society, and from the ghettos, they looked back at European society from the extreme margins. They looked with skepticism at a wide array of cultural frameworks and ideologies that were fast losing their self-evidence, including the ideological constructs that we call literary genres. I thus organized my book, as you can see on the table of contents, not only around the three ghettos with the most extensive cultural production, Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna, but all belonging to the Second Polish Republic, the interwar Poland, but also according to genre. So you can see that I have novel, poetry, short prose one, which is self-writing or autobiographical attempts, short prose two, which are forays into popular literary modes like Sherlock Holmes tales, and to advance also, you have the Gothic, ghetto Gothic, and an incredible writer, Shia Spiegel, who wrote. He also survived of these writers. He's the only one who survived and published a lot of his work from the ghetto, but also revised and new work through a long career. He lived into the 1990s. And Oscar Rosenfeld, the one author that I deal with, who writes in German, he has a great story called Meine zwei Nachbarn, My Two Neighbors, which is a tour de force, kind of rifling through low genres and how equipped or ill-equipped they are for dealing with the situation of his protagonist. So I highly recommend those. But I'm going to move on to do a little more justice and in-depth analysis of a text that I think will be of particular interest to this group, I hope. And that is Labe Golden's story, Chronic van een Mesles, or Chronicle of a Single Day. Another plausible translation would be Chronicle of 24 Hours. Mesles is a 24-hour period. And so I hope that, although I won't, give you a thumbnail sketch of each chapter, I hope that just even that overview kind of gives you a sense of the great diversity of literary writing in the ghettos. Writers took up high and low forms, conventional and experimental models, and an array of genres, including the novel, short story, poetry, autobiography, reportage, and essay. My readings frequently attend to how writers reflected on the received literary forms that they deployed in an attempt to plumb the changing meanings of their volatile and nearly always worsening circumstances. They measured the distance between the world of the ghettos and the social and cultural worlds in which such literary conventions could be taken for granted, as they no longer could be in the ghettos. In more and less explicit ways, the interval between the literary resources the ghetto writers availed themselves of and the new universe of the ghetto, in which the preconditions for such cultural forms no longer necessarily obtained, that interval haunts these texts at every turn. So with my remaining time, I'd like to explore this text by Leib Golden. It's a modernist autobiographical portrayal of the interior life of a man starving in the Warsaw Ghetto, chronic less. Before the war, Golden had worked as a journalist and a literary translator into Yiddish. He was a secular leftist, and for that reason, he served time in Polish jails. He was in the Communist Party, which was illegal at the time in Poland. Um, he alludes to this in the story. But he later left the Communist Party and joined the Bund, the Yiddishist Socialist Party, in interwar Poland in 1936. As one of the most ubiquitous and defining experiences of the ghettos, hunger is an ineluctably obsessive motif running through the great diversity of ghetto writings. It's everywhere in ghetto writings, as you can imagine. Written in Yiddish in the Warsaw Ghetto in August 1941 and preserved in the first cache of the Oenig Shabbos archive, so in those tins that we saw, the text opens with an epigraph paraphrasing what was widely considered a watershed work of modern Yiddish literature, I.L. Peretz's 1888 ballad Monish. And so I don't know if you can see, but if you look in the upper left here, you see Anders wollt mein Lied geklungen, wenn ich soll Megan Alsting, underlined Alsting singen, paraphrase von Monish. So that's an important kind of way he's framing his project. Because Peretz famously deployed irony in this Monish poem, this 1888 poem, um, he deployed irony to lament in Yiddish the poverty of the Yiddish language, which kept it from achieving the greatness of established European cultures. All the while, he was also calling into question the true desirability of European romantic plots and heroes as cultural models to emulate. So he's sort of ironizing in both directions, Yiddish to European literature, European to Yiddish. Golden updates this double-edged weighing of European and Yiddish perspectives by engaging in sustained dialogue with modernist texts by authors including Knut Hamsun, Thomas Mann, and Arthur Schnitzler. Golden's autobiographical speaker grapples with European high literary models from his particular vantage point as a man starving in the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1941. He probes what help the rich palette of European literature can offer for rendering the real-time experience of the ghetto, for rendering hunger time. A single temporal divide structures Golden's literary phenomenology of a day in the life of a Warsaw Ghetto inmate. Waiting for the midday soup, his only sustenance, consuming it, and recommencing the long wait. This minimal plot introduces us to important scenes and aspects of ghetto life, which the protagonist, named Arka, either remembers or encounters as he walks to and from the soup kitchen. And once again, this was really the soup kitchen run by Rachel Auerbach, who is largely responsible for recovering this text and other texts in the archive. He remembers the burial in a mass grave of his friend Friedman, who has died the day before, of starvation or of suicide. And he kind of wonders over and over again which one it was. We see food tantalizingly for sale, but at prohibitive prices. We see secondhand dealers in the streets. On his way to the soup kitchen, Arkin nearly trips over a corpse lying on the ground. We encounter the Palatsovka workers who went daily to work outside the ghetto, and Arca and his empty stomach debate whether he should have tried to get himself a spot among them. By now, he was so emaciated that this is no longer a possibility. He fantasizes about what the chairman of the Judenrat, he fantasizes about writing to the chairman of the Judenrat to ask for a modest daily bread ration. At the kitchen, we are introduced to the system of meal tickets. Preoccupied with people sitting at another table, Arca does not notice when the server fills his bowl without taking his ticket. He thus has a rare opportunity, posing both an ethical dilemma and, should he be caught, a real danger of having his bowl filled a second time. Returning from the kitchen, Arca is plagued by self-recriminations about his own moral decline and by a bout of paranoia that everyone, in particular the director of social assistance, who passes by conveyed in a rickshaw, a means of transportation for the quote-unquote privileged of the ghetto, it's kind of a taxi in the ghetto, can see that he cheated the system. He's paranoid that everyone can see that he cheated the system to receive a second bowl of soup and will now have his soup kitchen privileges revoked. Arca has further quote-unquote luck when he later finds a cucumber lying in the street. The final, highly significant external event is a surgical operation that Arca witnesses through the window of the children's hospital in the ghetto. Arca has frequently asked himself if the Jews in the ghetto have been reduced to the status of beasts. This operation convinces him that they have not. Even though Arca characterizes the operation as possibly, quote, pointless or even criminal, end quote, it is unmistakably human. Quote, animals do not operate on their young, end quote. Now, while these events are important to chronicle, the narrative, an extended interior monologue or interior dialogue, if you want, between Arca and his stomach, consists overwhelmingly of Arca's flights into thought, reverie, memory, and the world of various literary texts and topoi, which are intermittently undercut by Arca's relentlessly insistent stomach, who mocks all such quote unquote stories. That's the stomach's dismissive word for any kind of intellectual or cultural pursuit. He wants food. He doesn't want, doesn't want culture. Featured prominently among the remembered and imagined quote unquote stories of before and beyond the ghetto are classics of Western literature and in particular of Jewish and European modernism. It is largely through the dialogue it maintains with other literary models, and in particular through assaying the limits of modernist aesthetics, that Golden's experimental text gives a searing account of the subjective experience of a life reduced, second after second, to hunger. Golden's modernist psychological portrait depicts consciousness hard up against its physiological limits. It is an extended interior dialogue between a man and his stomach, in which the stomach threatens to displace the narrating subjectivity altogether. Just to underscore how astoundingly this is, so what Golden's autobiographical protagonist thinks about, most, I guess, is hunger, and a close second is books. Golden's narrative self-consciously rifles through numerous romantic, realist, and modernist tropes as it situates itself vis-a-vis an array of authors and texts, including Goethe, Romain Rolland, Tolstoy, Balzac, and Jakob Wassermann. Arca discards the majority of these literary models as quickly as he invokes them, as being insufficient for rendering life in the ghetto. For example, Golden ironically juxtaposes the dialogue between Arca's stomach and diminishing self with the romantic trope of two people battling within one, whose locus classicus is, of course, Goethe's Faust. No. These transliterations are just for the purpose of this lecture, not to be shared, please. That's the epigraph, and here is the passage in English. So, why are you yelling like that? Because I want to. Because I, your stomach, am hungry. Do you realize that by now? Who is talking to you in this way? You are two people, Arca. It's a lie. No posing. Don't be so conceited. That kind of split was all right at one time when one was full. Then one could say, two people are battling in me, and one could make a dramatic martyred face. Yes, this kind of thing can be found quite often in literature. But today, don't talk nonsense. It's you and your stomach. It's your stomach and you. It's 90% your stomach and a little bit you. A small remnant, an insignificant remnant of the Arca who once was, the one who thought, read, taught, dreamed. Yes, stomach of mine, listen. Such an Arca existed once. Once he read a Roland, lived side by side with a Jean Christophe, admired an Annette, laughed with a Brognon. Yes, and for a little while he was even a Hans Castorp by some writer, Thomas Mann. I say. Literature has a double function in Golden's text. It serves Golden as a means of conveying the reality of a life of starvation in the ghetto, albeit negatively, precisely insofar as Golden rejects literature, as he does here, as a viable way to render this reality. However, literature also serves Arca as a memory anchor. It recalls his former self in a world in which the conditions to support the humanistic values for which literature does shorthand still obtained, a world in which it was still possible to be the contemporary of a Jean-Christophe Annette and Colas Brognon, all characters in eponymous novels by Romain Rolland. As we will see, Golden's relationship to Mann's Magic Mountain, the protagonist of which is Hans Castorp, is more complex. Golden's text is both anti-literature and literature at the same time, at once a reckoning with literature's now useless illusions and an abiding attempt to continue to produce literature even under the dehumanizing conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. Golden's self-testing vis-a-vis literature is a prominent strategy in Chronicle of a Single Day. It is in fact while Arca is gazing at other faces in the soup kitchen, lost in a reverie about how ill-equipped the conventions of realist prose would be for rendering such faces, that he unknowingly receives his first bowl of soup without having his ticket taken. And he says, somehow the people sitting here all have such long faces, not having eaten faces, with swollen ghetto spots under their eyes, which give the face a Mongolian look. You think of a master of world literature, a Tolstoy, a Balzac, a Wassermann, how they made a fuss over people. They chiseled every feature, every move. You seem to be somewhat pale today, one of these geniuses would write, and the world was enraptured. You seem to be somewhat pale today, and women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. Critics interpreted it, and serious, business-like gentlemen, owners of textile factories or partners in large, comfortable manufacturing businesses beneath wide marble signs, held a quiver in their cheeks, reminiscent of the first kiss 50 years ago. You seem to be somewhat pale today. Ha ha. If someone today were to read or write, you seem somewhat pale today, when the whole world is deathly pale, when everyone has the same white, chalky, lime white face. Yes, yes, it was easy for them to write. They ate and knew that their readers were going to eat and that the critics were going to eat. Let those masters now show their true colors and write. The representational conventions of European realism function in symbolic exchanges between authors, readers, and critics only under certain social conditions. The most basic being that authors, readers, and critics all eat. The self-alienation experienced in starvation is here reflected in the alienation of banal phrases from any socio-literary context in which they could stain meaning at the physiological limit between culture and naked biology, such literary commonplaces are no longer merely banal, but grotesque. Yet, Golden does not evoke literary models only to reject them. He also engages two modernist authors in a more sustained and meaningful way, Thomas Mann and Arthur Schnitzler. Notwithstanding the already quoted reference to Mann's Hans Castorp as a figure with whom Arca once identified, but who now seems hopelessly quaint, Mann's exploration of the malleability of time in the Magic Mountain has profound resonances for Arca as he experiences the paradoxes of hunger time in the ghetto. The passage in the manuscript leading up to Golden's second mention of Mann's novel is indecipherable. That first cache of Oleg Chavez documents in the tins lit in water, so there was a pretty substantial damage to a great many of them, including to this one, although not so terrible to this one, but enough. Um, so, but the after the damaged lines, however, the text continues. Maybe it, which is to say the day's soup, will already have been poured. Oh, how magnificently Thomas Mann describes it in The Magic Mountain. I remember his thoughts, the way he delineated them. Never has their brilliant truth appeared so clear to me as it does now. Time and time. Now it stretches like rubber, and then it's gone, like a dream, like smoke. Right now, of course, it's stretched out horribly. Horribly, it's really enough to kill you. The war has been going on for a full 2 years, and you've eaten nothing but soup for some 4 months. And those few months are thousands and thousands of times longer for you than the whole of the previous 20 months. No longer than your whole life until now. From yesterday's soup to today's is an eternity. And I can't imagine that I'll be able to survive another 24 hours of this overpowering hunger. But these 4 months are no more than a dark, empty nightmare. Try to salvage something from them. Remember something in particular, it's impossible. One black, dark mass. Here, Arca does not, as he had with Goethe, Tolstoy, Balzac, Wassermann, and perhaps less emphatically, Roland, dismiss a literary model as incompatible with the experience of the ghetto. Instead, Mann's experimentation with time captures a quote unquote brilliant truth that Arca says has, quote, never appeared so clear to me as it does now, end quote. It is precisely Mann's modernist experimentation that seems capable of doing some justice to the temporal disorientation of hunger time in the ghetto, in which an acute insistence on every painful moment is wedded to dark expansiveness devoid of content. The other author Golden engages with in considerable depth is the fin de siècle Viennese master of psychological subtlety and interior monologue, Schnitzler. In the case of this German-speaking modernist, too, Golden is not simply dismissive. After awaking at 5 in the morning with 8 hours to go until the midday soup, Arca attempts to pass the time by reading a book by Schnitzler. And he says, how does one get through the 7 hours or even the nearest two? Read? Your brain won't take it in. All the same, you pull the book out from under the pillow. German, Otto Schnitzler, publisher so-and-so, year, printer. Ava looked into the mirror. You turn the first page and realize you've understood no more than the first sentence. Ava looked into the mirror. You've reached the end of the second page, didn't understand a single word. Yesterday, the soup was thin and almost cold. You sprinkled in some salt, which didn't dissolve properly. And yesterday, Friedman died of starvation, definitely of hunger. You could see that he wouldn't last long. And there's a gnawing in my stomach. If you only had a quarter of a loaf now, one of the quarter loaves over there, a square-shaped quarter loaf, like the ones in every display window on every little table. Oh, brother, you realize that you jumped up. The idea was so delicious. There's some name or other on page 4 of the novella, Dionysia. Where she's from and what she wants, you don't know. There, a quarter of a loaf. There, a bowl of soup. The diegetic book, um, the book that he's ostensibly reading, may correspond to an actual published volume of Schnitzler's writings. However, Golden's allusions to this ostensible Schnitzler text strongly suggest that it does not correspond to an actual book. Golden's evocation of another Schnitzler scene further suggests that he is alluding to scenes or even evoking Schnitzler-esque scenes from memory. And This is the last quote I'm going to quote from this text, so I think I might let you read in English and let Golden's Yiddish, as it were, have the last word. So he says, "Hab sich als halt noch als das Bichel, Seitel 7. Lass es weglezen. Ich blätter es durch. Ergens auf der Seite, hab das Auge Wort. Wonne. Teinig. Eine scharfe, großartige, erotische Szene. Ein paar Blätter früher haben sie gegessen in einem Restaurant. Schnitzler gibt dir den Menü. Nein, nein, nicht lehnen. Es wird dir mal ein Bitter in Mäul. Ein Kopf verdreht sich. So beschlagt dir ein Hitz. Nicht lehnen wie so im Nest. Oder so wie alte Leid hippern über sexuelle Beschreibungen. Wie spät ist? Halb sieben. Ui, wie fries ist noch? So in English, I realize that I'm still holding the book, page 7. Let's see if I can get through it. I turn the pages. Somewhere on one of the pages, my eye spots the German word Wonne, which means ecstasy, a piquant, magnificent erotic scene. A few pages earlier, they were eating in a restaurant. Schnitzler gives you the menu. No, no, don't read it. Your mouth becomes strangely bitter inside. Your head spins. Don't read about how they eat. That's right, just as old people skip descriptions of sex. What's the time? 6:30. Oh, how early it still is. Oh, okay. So one might think here of the seduction scene involving the husband and the sweet young thing, der Gatte und das süße Mädel, that transpires in a cabinet particulier of a Viennese restaurant in Schnitzler's famous play Reigen. Schnitzler's stage directions there indicate remnants of a meal, including fruit, cheese, pastries, and Hungarian white wine. Uh, um, However, the word Vona does not occur in that play. Whether Golden simply uses poetic license in staging Arca's reading of a book by Schnitzler, or if his rather impressionistic evocation of Schnitzler's text and characteristic scenes is due to the vagaries of a starving man's memory, it is significant that he chooses to stage this encounter with Schnitzler as an attempt on Arca's part to navigate an actual book with a publisher, year, printer, and specific page numbers. Whereas Arca merely remembers Mann and his treatment of time, he tries to read Schnitzler. What can we infer from this? And I'll wrap things up with this as a conclusion. I would argue Schnitzler is both a foil and a model for Golden's writing of hunger. To an extent, Arca rejects Schnitzler, as he does other writers, as woefully inadequate for capturing the ghetto experience. Arca is too hungry and exhausted even to process Schnitzler's sentences, and there is little in the content of Schnitzler's stories to which Arca can relate. The one tantalizing element in Schnitzler's text is not his erotic preoccupations, but his depictions of food, which must be skipped over, just as old people skip descriptions of sex, a poignant note of humor. However, what Golden is doing with Schnitzler is more complex and profound than a simple gesture of rejection. In Golden's story, Schnitzler is transformed from discrete texts to fleeting, scrambled impressions that juxtapose and fuse what should be kept apart. Schnitzler's texts melt into one another. Fräulein Elsa, perhaps, is renamed Eva, and her famous mirror scene appears to inaugurate a novella 4 pages into which Dionysia appears, and by page 7, the erotic fairy tale narrative of Die Hirtenflöte, the only Schnitzler text featuring a Dionysia, has ostensibly yielded to a realist portrayal of a Viennese restaurant scene, followed by an erotic interlude. Arca, that is, does not merely fail in his ability to concentrate on a recognizable text by Schnitzler, but quite radically deranges Schnitzler's oeuvre as he reads it from a position of extreme hunger. Strikingly, Arca's inability to read Schnitzler lucidly and straightforwardly, his incapacity to remain focused on the page or to extract anything from the text, but fleeting words, names, and impressions, results in an unmistakably Schnitzler-inflected form of interior monologue. The very distraction from Schnitzler as a bound book reproduces and pushes to a radical limit the chief literary innovation for which Schnitzler is rightly known, the subtle rendering of subjective experience through interior monologue. Golden appropriates Schnitzlerian interior monologue to capture part of the limited experience of the Warsaw Ghetto, precisely, if paradoxically, by using interior monologue to depict the limit at which Schnitzler's literary project becomes both thematically and literally physiologically unreadable. Golden belittles literature, culture, and intellectuals because of the vanity of cultural pretensions and pursuits revealed from the vantage point of the wasting body. Yet, Golden is also trying to sustain himself through reading and making literature. In this, Golden's literary project mirrors his wasting body. Just as his body is cannibalizing itself in order to sustain itself, eating itself in order to feed itself, killing itself in order to live, Golden's text metabolizes and destroys a literary corpus of above all modernist works in order to sustain itself. Golden's text is a work of literature trying to feed on literature and starving. It rifles through various literary modalities only to arrive at the ultimate limit of the usefulness of literature in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is that one can't eat it. Golden's text is in this sense a self-metabolizing work of literature, a writing of and from hunger. And I'll stop there. I have more that I could go on, but I want to make sure that we have some time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Eric. This is very moving. And I'm just wondering whether this reflection that you just read, this response to Schnitzer, whether you found that in other authors as well, that they couldn't really relate to basically anything outside their horrific experience, life-threatening experience.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that I wouldn't say they couldn't relate at all. I mean, I think there are ways that, he relates to Mann and Schnitzler very differently than a lot of the models that he more or less categorically dismisses as sort of being not very serviceable to the kind of things that he's dealing with. So I think he does relate in many ways to Mann and Schnitzler, but in a very creative and active, kind of actively thinking through his position and what is it, and kind of asks what can the power of European literature, is it powerful enough to render this experience of virtually absolute powerlessness, right? That's kind of what he's doing. But yes, in answer to your question, I find a great deal of kind of thinking through past literary models, European literary models, from the very new dire circumstances of the ghetto. So a kind of surveying of what these literary genres and the expectations of genres and the preconditions really for these genres to function. What do they mean now that those preconditions are often not given, right? So it is the kind of measuring of the experience of the ghetto through the inadequacy in a way of former literary models, but not a mere rejection. But so you see that in a great many texts. And Sherlock, I mean, they look at Sherlock Holmes, and so it can be high or low, or the Gothic kind of horror tale. The Spiegel, one of the stories, literally starts on a dark and stormy night, and it kind of goes through there. So what are the horrors that are kind of scintillating and kind of give us a kind of a pleasurable sense of horror, right? That's kind of what this kind of consumerist, relationship to horror tales outside the ghetto. What does that look like when the horrors are real? When the horrors are really real and existential. So there's that kind of measuring, and those are just some of the examples. Another poem written by Shmuel Marvel in the Warsaw Ghetto constantly asks itself. It's very explicit that he keeps apostrophizing his poem itself and says, "Oh, poem," and so he's asking, can I even write a lyric poem about, all these corpses frozen in the street and dogs eating them? And I mean, it's just these horrible, horrible scenes that are, real in his daily life in the street. The poem is called "The Street." So he's trying to kind of take the measure of the situation by its um, compatibility or lack thereof with literary traditions here, lyric poetry. So yeah, so that happens quite a lot, and it was that's one of the kind of most fundamental discoveries that I sort of made in doing this project is that there is this very active meta reflection on the status of literature from this point. So just to sum this up, I think the strongest argument, or to me at least, the most important argument I make is that although the ghettos were just terrible places and nobody should have been in them and nobody wanted to be in them, but they were also places that people were not merely persecuted as they absolutely were, but they also actively thought from, right? They were actively thinking and writing and meditating on their condition and on their relationship to culture. And I think it's an important place that we need to take it seriously as a locus of thinking and writing, and not merely as a place to think about people as sort of silenced and cut out. But these people are actively thinkers that we need to read and think with.
Yeah, I very much agree with you that, that it's about time to destroy this myth of the Jews going into without any resistance, walking into their or towards their death, because there was a lot of resistance happening, a lot of active, as you cited in the very beginning, minds were as active as before the war. And I think this is the book that you published is just one big proof of the creativity and the vitality of people that people were trying to hold up as much as they could under the circumstances, under the life-threatening circumstances they were under. So I think that's a very important proof that you make there. So Joseph is asking, do you think Schnitzler's name, which could remind a hungry person of the food word schnitzel, is also part of Golden's literary purpose?
Right. Perhaps. Yeah, he certainly gets the food in Schnitzler. Yeah, I'm not sure how much that food that particular food would resonate with people in the ghetto, but it's possible. Yeah, that's a good question. He was a Viennese author, you know.
Uh, so before we go to these very specific questions, I'm just wondering how you got to um, research the literature. Were you a scholar of Yiddish language, or so where did this interest come from?
Okay, so actually, I was not a scholar. I mean, I was interested in Yiddish and had done a Yiddish summer program that was done by YIVO, and it was still at Columbia at that time. It's moved, but so I did a summer program, and I had prepared a lot by doing my own study of Yiddish textbooks and so on. But my Yiddish, was and still is getting better, but not as good as I hope that it will be. I'm always trying to improve it. But the seed for this book really was at a seminar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have week-long seminars for faculty teaching on the Holocaust, and the one I did was on Holocaust literature, co-led by the very excellent scholars Sarah Horowitz and David Roskies. And they were both great, but Roskies is someone who studies wartime writing, among many other things. And he introduced me to a lot of these texts from the ghettos. And it was really kind of a revelation to me because probably like some people in the audience, I assumed that people in ghettos would just be so miserable and so hungry and so destitute and just have, just existential concerns that they wouldn't really be able, to think on sort of high levels and very nuanced kind of ways about cultural issues and then I was ashamed to realize that was a terrible kind of um, attitude to bring to these texts, or uh, that of course people think, right? I mean, even in terrible situations, people are thinking are creative because I think it's just a human capacity. I mean, there are certain circumstances where it's just not possible, and in the camps it was much less possible. Just even getting a pencil or a piece of paper and somewhere to hide that or store it was very, very difficult. But even there were people who wrote incredible reflections that have come down to us. So like the record is not silent even from the death camps. But that was the moment when I'd always actually been a little bit resistant to studying or doing research on the Holocaust because I didn't like the idea of kind of people liking to study dead Jews more than living Jews in Jewish culture. So not that I don't think that, God forbid, I think the Holocaust should be studied, but I was more attracted to studying things that Jews were doing culturally and historically when they weren't being slaughtered. That was kind of what I was more interested in. But this made me realize that it was possible to do a study of the Holocaust in a culturally rich and kind of culturally specific way. And one of the things I had to do, I was in the midst of writing my first book and my tenure book, and so it took a while to get to this one. And I also realized I had to kind of redouble my efforts to get my Yiddish up to speed well enough to do some justice to this. There's also a lot of writing in Polish, and I can't read Polish, and so I didn't. There's one text in Polish that I dealt with in translation because it's more of an essay, less. It was more like the reference to Sherlock Holmes I was interested in than the kind of texture of literary writing. But I certainly, if I had the skill, I would have done much more with Polish. There's a lot of clearly powerful literary works in Polish, even powerful in translation.
Hmm.
But that was the seed. That was the seed. Yeah, there's that seminar and realizing that there was a kind of way that was very important to me. And I felt like there's so much writing about Holocaust literature, so much thought about the Holocaust, and just these absolutely incredible texts that are really underknown. And so it just surprised me that how can we have a canon, really a well-established canon of literary writing about the Holocaust. And in some ways, what I consider kind of the core texts written during the Holocaust are quite marginal to that canon. And that seemed like, wow, that's in a project that's worth committing to. And that's kind of why I decided to write it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I can also imagine them getting together every week and exchanging their thoughts and their maybe their writings even to be intellectually inspired, really. Uh,
There, some did, yeah. So
I,
there was a it was a writers' circle in Lodz, for example, under the poet oh gosh, I'm forgetting her name. Lily, uh, Ulinova. I'm terribly embarrassed that I'm a little nervous since I'm forgetting her name, but Miriam Ulinova, yes, an established poet. And so people did come together and read and exchange poems. Itzhak Katzenelson was a prominent writer in the Warsaw Ghetto. Some of his stuff was published in underground journals. There was a Zionist youth movement that had its own underground publication, modest, but they were able to put some things out. Other things were planned and disrupted by the deportation. Katzenelson also writes of reading his stuff to other friends, other people. The person I mentioned that poem about the street, he mentions in a letter that has come down to us that he read regularly to these other literary, figures in the ghetto. And there were also literary sort of evenings that where people came together in somewhat semi-public sort of spaces and read original work and also recited established poems and things like so. Literature, and in the Vilna ghetto, there was a theater that was very active with established works and also some new works that were performed. So there were, the chances, the possibilities for a kind of an open literary culture were limited, but certainly some of these things did have a kind of public audience and a reception within the ghettos.
yeah.
And some we don't know. Some it's like it's hard to know if a given text, if it's documented that it was read here, then we know, but otherwise we don't know. It's presumably maybe somebody read some of these, and sometimes maybe they didn't. It's hard to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, In so Zola is asking in Vilna, my uncle Leib Rosenthal, who was a prolific poet and writer and activist before the war, then began writing many of the songs sung by the actors and singers, including my mother, Chayela Rosenthal, his sister in the Vilna ghetto, songs that were a great form of spiritual resistance, hope, entertainment, as well as chronicling life in the ghetto. In your studies, did you come across any of his work?
Um, I didn't come across him. Can I ask a follow-up question? Are his songs from the ghetto preserved? Have they come down to us?
So we might have to wait a little bit.
Yeah, so there are, songs were a huge part of Jewish culture in the ghettos, and so there were so-called Gassensingers, so street singers, who wrote original poems and informed in poetry and entertained in poetry. Sometimes were kind of like buskers trying to get some scrap of bread or some kind of food, but also doing social satire, satirizing the figures of the Jewish councils and other aspects of food distribution policy. So there's a lot of kind of things that kind of actively commented on in very creative, kind of on the spot sort of songs that were generated in the ghettos, and other ones that were very important for partisans and resistance movement. And some became kind of best, like kind of almost hits or something in the ghettos. And so that there are books about songs in the ghettos. Um, that's not something that I've focused on so much in this book, but thank you, and I will look up Leigh Rosenthal and see about his work in the Vilna Ghetto. It's incredible that you have that story.
Yes, and Zola says, yes, there's a book of many of his songs and others written in the ghetto that my mom handwrote after the war. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has copies of
Wow,
that,
incredible.
which is amazing. So it seems like there's still uh, so much research to be done. And
Absolutely. I mean, this I've begun. I mean, like I said, this I didn't do an exhaustive kind of. I sort of wanted to do deeper dives to give a sense that this is really rewarding literature to really try to think with, and to try to model that in some ways. And there's so much more. This is scratching the surface. And so if as I say, I think in the epilogue, if my book in some years were one among a great library, a shelf of work on this stuff, and it was kind of almost a footnote to more work. I would be overjoyed at that. That would be fantastic. So there is much, much. Not that I'm the first one to do it, but there are, of course, people that came before me that worked on aspects of this literature, and David Roski's and Shantu, whom I mentioned, but others as well, of course. But still, relative to what there is to talk about, there's relatively little on this body of work.
yeah. So Stephen is asking, what was the extent of these authors' writings prior to the Holocaust? There were many German scholars that embraced uh, Nazi ideology, such as Alfred Bäumler. Did any of the Jewish authors interact with universities prior to the Holocaust, and how were they treated there?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, so the question of sort of access to higher institutions of culture and learning was more limited for Jews. So, for example, Ringelblum, who was a very talented historian and wrote on kind of early modern Jewish-Polish relations mostly, and was a very active member of a historical Kreis circle, and in the YIVO, if you know that Yiddish sort of centered cultural institution established in Vilna in the 20s. He was an active, participant in that. But so he had a degree from the in history, had a doctorate from the University of Warsaw, but there were no chairs in Jewish history at and really any European university, let alone a Polish university. So he actually made his livelihood by teaching at a girls' Jewish school, and was, just seemed to be tireless. He was also a social kind of activist, and well, I won't go into everything he did, but incredible person and did a lot and seemed to have endless energy. He was also a political activist in his sort of left Coalition party. So that's kind of typical. People tended to have other gigs, to pay rent, and their publications were often like the Yivo, Blätter für Geschichte, things that they kind of started themselves. So. I'm trying to think now. Some of them were established authors before the war. Hermann Kruk, who wrote in the Vilna ghetto, and he's one of the one who writes a kind of Sherlock Holmes account of a true crime kind of event in the Vilna ghetto. He was a socialist librarian, so he was, and that was a very real thing in Jewish culture before the war. So he established the largest the grocery library in Warsaw, and he was the librarian who really consolidated that into a major library. He ended up in Vilna during the war. So people were kind of prominent, some of them very prominent sort of cultural figures. He wasn't a great writer. Yehoshua Perla was a very well respected, also kind of controversial. He sort of wrote on two tracks. Perla, he wrote very high, great books, and they also kind of wrote trash, called Schund in Yiddish, and was criticized by some people for writing this sort of trashy stuff to make money. But his best stuff was always universally praised, and it was really great stuff. So he was a known quantity. Spiegel, for example, had just begun to publish the guy who wrote so many short stories and wonderful, great literary short stories. I encourage you. And one of his volumes is there is an English translation of some of his texts called Ghetto Kingdom. That's the title story of the first book that Spiegel or Spiegel, you can say Isaiah Spiegel. He's translated in different. His name figures in different ways. But so he had published a book of poetry, but he was an unknown or very little known. Became a prominent writer in the Yiddish world after the war. But so you know. Those are just some examples. Katznelson was actually more of a pedagogue. He had also written. He had a system of Hebrew language schools in Lodz, and just as Crook went from Warsaw to Vilna, Katznelson went from Lodz to Warsaw. So he wrote mostly in Hebrew. He was a Zionist and was trying to educate people in Hebrew, and was kind of the rector of a system of Hebrew language schools. But he wrote in Hebrew, in mostly in Yiddish during the war because he wanted to reach a greater audience, and that's kind of the language of the people, whereas Hebrew was limited to a few highly educated or Hebrew literate readers. So but yeah, so he was fairly well known, as a writer and certainly as a pedagogue, and he'd written plays and pedagogical works and stuff. So these people tended to have careers, but then a guy like who we talked about, Lev Golden, who we explored today, he was a journalist, he and a translator. He hadn't published, he wasn't a published writer. So some people sort of started writing more in the ghetto. Some people continued to write in the ghetto.
Hmm.
A bit of all those things, but I don't think anyone was terribly famous besides maybe Perla and Crook as a librarian, but not really as a writer. Katznelson, and those are
Yeah,
probably the ones that were most famous.
yeah. So I have a very like practical question. You showed this photograph of people at Yivo, I guess.
No, it's actually not at YIVO. It's at the Jewish Institute for History in Warsaw.
Right,
The
exactly.
Institute for Jewish History, yeah. So I can
Right,
provide
and you showed pouring over these
it.
damaged pages, and you showed
Yes,
the one page how damaged they were. So
yes.
uh, so there must have been many missing words and letters and so on. So who was that a communal attempt to complete the missing words, or like how did that work? It must have been really tough detective work, really, to
Right.
kind of figure out the texts from those damaged pages.
Yes. So I think you're absolutely right. So we can go back to the first page of the text that we explored today, Leib Golden's Chronic van een Mens, or Chronicle of 24 Hours. So some of this was actually among the text that was actually edited and published in Yiddish after the war. So, like I said, the reception of this archive got very caught up in the Cold War. The second cache is December 1950, and so it's in very Stalinist Warsaw. And I wouldn't say that the entire team at the Jewish Historical Institute were full-throated Stalinists, but there were communists. Most of the people that had been there left and went, most of them to Israel, some to New York, and because they didn't want to continue in communist Poland, and they felt that that wasn't a place where they could read the writing on the wall, and that wasn't a place where Jewish culture, as they understood it, had a chance of surviving. So the people who did stay were much more, they were communists. But not necessarily Stalinists, right? So, but they had to kind of toe the party line in order to get things out at all. So you have a kind of framing of these things, even in the stuff that did get published, as sort of affirming communist Poland or the virtues of communism, or that this is what the people who suffered in the ghetto were really fighting for, was a kind of free, democratic, which is to say communist Poland. And then people in New York saying that this is all just an absolute lie and a misrepresentation of the ideological kind of leanings and cultural dreams of the people and the martyrs and so on. So there was a whole kind of Cold War, back and forth, that I think marred in some ways, the reception, and limited the reception of this work. But in terms of simply getting it out, so some of them were published, sometimes also, in Warsaw in the 50s, sometimes also manipulated, and sometimes not, and sometimes accused of being manipulated when they weren't. But in terms of just reading the gaps, so sometimes they can read the words and they don't want to publish them because they want to make them more communist, basically, is what I'm saying. But even just when it's not overlaid by ideological pressures, just reading the words, one thing that they were very smart to do was generally have multiple copies of the text that they archived. And so sometimes you'll see, I can remember offhand if there are multiple copies of this one. I think there are. And so they're often damaged, but not identically damaged. So sometimes, if here in the middle it's missing, but maybe on the next page, some other part that's extant here is missing there. And so you can kind of triangulate and get it that way. Yeah, so and sometimes you just can't. Some of them are just so damaged that I'm working on documents that are, you can read parts of it, and then parts of it so far gone that you just kind of have to guess. Or actually, in fact, even the cover image of my book, uh, to give a good example, this is a poem mentioned by Shmuel Marvel, The Street, Die Goss in Yiddish. And this is the seventh page. It's a rather long poem. And this is the seventh page and the final page of the manuscript. And of course, Yiddish, like Hebrew and Arabic and sort of other languages, goes from right to left, right? So we have the beginnings of the final lines and increasingly less of each line of the final stanzas. And so we don't know. Well, we know how they begin, and and it's kind of a poignant sort of example or embodiment kind of this problem of the precarity of these texts, is that we can kind of guess what the tone is, but ultimately it's not possible to say definitively kind of what he was saying in these final lines of this poem, because we don't have them. They were damaged. So yeah, that's an example where there's just no recovering them. There's no extant copy that has those lines, and so that's sometimes the case. But yeah, so sometimes by having multiple copies, that helps a lot.
Yeah, thank you. So this is our last question, I would say. We feels like we could go on forever and
Yeah.
ever. Paul is asking, what is the state of knowledge about the text contained in the third missing tranche of Onyx Shabbos documents? And are there any literary texts which are known to have been archived in that trance that you wish you could access?
Right. Well, the main focus of that third tranche, and that's the latest one historically. So the second one was buried in August 3rd, 1942. So this is some weeks into the Great Deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto. So they realized that uh, that if we don't get this underground now, it's in danger of just being destroyed, right? And they're deporting the vast majority of the inhabitants of the ghetto to Treblinka, and so they got underground. And then the third one is after that, and so after that, of course, you have the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, is the kind of main event that we think of as after the deportation, when you have this very limited community left of slave laborers, and they rise up. So the focus of that is mostly the ghetto uprising, as is what I understand, and they think that tranche was buried under what is now the Chinese embassy in Warsaw, and there have been some probes. The Israeli government did some probes, and we're not able to find something. They did, I think, find some ash and something, so maybe it got burnt, and they don't know. So it seems that it's probably never going to be recovered. But my understanding, I don't know in direct answer to your question, I don't know of specific literary works that were buried in it, but a host of writing and thinking and documents about the ghetto uprising, I think is what mainly was in that tranche.
Mm, thank you so much. Um, I think we all need to read your book. So I put the link there, and we'll also put it in our follow-up email. Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your research and your knowledge about the topic with us. This is a very important study and research, because it really brings the ghetto existence much closer to us, and also, as we said, it shows how actively involved those in the ghettos were, no matter how dire the circumstances were. So thank you so much for your immense contribution there.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone who listened. It was an honor to be able to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. All the best, everyone. Take care.